In September 1940, a man walked up to a German checkpoint in occupied Warsaw. He had false papers, a fake name, and a plan so insane that his own commanding officers had told him, to his face, that it was suicide. He handed his documents to the SS guard. The guard looked at the papers, looked at the man, stamped them, and waved him through. That man, Witold Pilecki, had just volunteered to be arrested, to be sent to a Nazi concentration camp, on purpose. Not because he was captured, not because he had no choice, but because he decided, alone, in a basement in Warsaw, in the middle of an occupied city, that someone needed to go inside. Someone needed to see what was happening behind those walls. Someone needed to document it, get it out, and force the world to respond. What Pilecki found inside Auschwitz was beyond anything the outside world could imagine. What he did with that information would change the course of history, and the price he paid for it would not be settled until a bullet was fired in a basement in Warsaw 8 years later by the very government he had given everything to protect. But before we get there is a question you need to carry with you through this entire story. If a man walks voluntarily into the worst place on earth, documents crimes that history has never seen before, escapes from a camp no one was supposed to escape from, fights in the most brutal urban battle of the 20th century, survives it all, why does his own government execute him? That question does not have a simple answer, but by the end of this story, you will understand it completely, and it will not leave you. This is the story of Witold Pilecki, the man who did the impossible 3 times, the man history forgot on purpose, and the reason you have almost certainly never heard his name until right now. To understand what Pilecki did, you have to understand what kind of man he was before any of this happened, because men who do what Pilecki did are not born in a single moment. They are built, slowly, over decades, by everything that happens to them and everyone around them. Pilecki was born in 1901 in a small town called Olonets, in what is now northwestern Russia. But that geographical fact is almost meaningless without the context, because in 1901, Poland did not exist, not on any map, not in any diplomatic document, not as any recognized nation on the face of the earth. Poland had been carved up between 3 empires, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, more than a century before Pilecki was born. His people were a nation without a country, a language without a flag, a memory without a future. That shaped Pilecki from his earliest years in a way that is almost impossible to overstate. He did not grow up in a country that could be taken for granted. He grew up understanding, from childhood, that nations are not permanent, that freedom can be erased, that what one generation fights for, another generation can lose, and that the losing happens faster than anyone expects. His grandfather had fought in the Polish uprising of 1863, one of several doomed, heroic rebellions against Russian imperial control. The uprising had been crushed, the reprisals had been brutal, but the memory survived. His father passed it down to Pilecki the way some families pass down religious faith, as something sacred, something that required sacrifice, something worth suffering for. By the time Pilecki was 17 years old, he had already joined a Polish scouting organization that was, in practice, a paramilitary training ground for the independence movement. He was learning to shoot, learning to organize, learning to lead small groups of men under pressure. He was 17. Most 17-year-olds in occupied Poland had no future to plan for. Pilecki was already preparing for a war. In 1918, after the First World War shattered the old empires, Poland was reborn as an independent nation for the first time in over 100 years. The celebrations were extraordinary. A country that had not existed was suddenly real again. Borders were drawn, a government formed, and almost immediately, the new nation faced its first existential threat. In 1919 and 1920, the newly formed Soviet Red Army pushed west with the explicit intention of spreading communist revolution across Europe. Poland was in the way. The battle that followed, the Polish-Soviet War, is one of the most consequential and least discussed conflicts of the 20th century. The Red Army drove deep into Polish territory. Warsaw itself was threatened. Western Europe watched and largely did nothing. And then, in August 1920, in what military historians would later call the miracle on the Vistula, the Polish army, outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting for its existence, shattered the Soviet advance and drove the Red Army back. It was one of the most decisive military reversals in modern history, and Pilecki, 19 years old, was there. He fought in that war. He earned decorations for his courage. He had seen with his own eyes what it looked like when an army fought for the survival of a nation, and he had seen what it looked like when that nation won. After the war, Pilecki settled into the life of a man who had already done more than most people do in a lifetime, and who seemed content to let that be enough. He married a woman named Maria Ostrowska in 1931. They had 2 children, a son, Andrzej, and a daughter, Zofia. He managed an estate in eastern Poland, farming the land, raising horses. He painted watercolors, he wrote poetry. By the accounts of people who knew him, he was a warm and thoughtful man, serious when he needed to be, but given to humor and to long conversations about ideas. He was deeply religious, in the quiet, private way of someone for whom faith is a personal matter rather than a performance. He was not, by any outward appearance, a man preparing for anything extraordinary. He was a husband and a father and a farmer who happened to have fought in a war 20 years ago. He coached the local youth scouting group. He organized cultural events in his community. But there was something in him that never fully settled, a restlessness that the quiet life of the countryside couldn't quite extinguish, a sense, described by people who knew him, that he was always watching, always thinking, always calculating what would need to be done when the moment came, as if some part of him had never fully left the battlefield, as if some part of him already knew that the peace would not last. He was right. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland from the west. 2.5 weeks later, on September 17th, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Poland, the country Pilecki had bled for in 1920, the country where he had built his home and raised his children, was crushed between 2 of the most powerful military machines in human history. The Polish government fled to Romania and eventually to London. The Polish army fought until it couldn't. Warsaw fell on September 28th. In less than a month, the country was gone again. Pilecki sent his wife and children to safety in the countryside. Then he went to Warsaw. He joined the underground resistance almost immediately. In November 1939, he helped found the secret Polish army, one of the very first organized underground resistance movements in all of occupied Europe. They were small, they were poorly armed, they had no support from outside, but they were organized and they were determined, and they understood that the occupation was not the end of the story. They gathered weapons, they recruited members, they built communication networks, they planned for a future that seemed in late 1939 almost impossible to imagine. But something was wrong. Something beyond the daily order of occupation, beyond the executions and the curfews and the confiscations. Something that none of them fully understood yet. Reports were filtering in from the eastern part of occupied Poland. Fragments, second-hand accounts, stories passed from person to person until they lost their edges and became almost unbelievable. About a camp the Germans had built near a small Polish town called Auschwitz. The Germans had renamed it. They called it Auschwitz. People were being sent there. Soldiers, intellectuals, resistance members, priests, ordinary people caught in street roundups. They went in, they did not come back. The letters stopped. The families heard nothing. And the rumors that did circulate were so extreme, torture, mass murder, systematic starvation, that many people chose not to believe them, because believing them required accepting something about the world that the human mind resists accepting. Pilecki listened to every report that came in. He processed them, he tested them against each other, and he came to a conclusion that would define the rest of his life. The world needed to know what was happening inside that camp. Not rumors, not fragments. Real, documented, specific intelligence. The kind of intelligence that could not be dismissed. The kind that would force the world to respond. Someone had to go inside and get it. He proposed the mission to his commanding officers in the summer of 1940. He did not propose it because he was ordered to. He did not propose it because he had been singled out. He proposed it because he believed it was necessary, and because he believed he was the right person to do it, and because, as far as he could tell, no one else was stepping forward. The reaction from his superiors was immediate and almost universally negative. They told him it was suicide. They told him no intelligence operation in human history had involved a trained agent voluntarily entering enemy captive. They told him he would be identified, tortured, and killed, and that whatever intelligence he managed to gather would die with him. Pilecki's response, as recorded by one of the officers present, was calm and simple. He said that if no one went in, no one would ever know, and if no one ever knew, nothing would ever be done, and if nothing was done, the killing would continue indefinitely. He asked for approval. His commanding officer, after several days of deliberation, gave it. They built him a false identity, a Polish civilian named Jan Tomasz Serafiński. They created papers, a backstory, a history. They chose a date, September 19, 1940, when a German street roundup, a Lepanka, was expected in the Zeleborg district of Warsaw. The Germans conducted these roundups regularly, grabbing random civilians off the street and processing them into the forced labor system. Many ended up in Auschwitz. Pilecki would let them take him. The night before he left for Warsaw, Pilecki sat down and wrote a letter to his wife Maria. We know he wrote it. We know it was personal and final in its tone. We do not know everything it said, because Maria kept it private. But we know one thing he told her. He told her not to wait for him. He told her that he did not know if he was coming home. He sealed the letter, he slept, and in the morning he walked to the place where the roundup was scheduled to happen, and he waited for the Germans to come. September 19, 1940, early morning, Warsaw. The SS and German police moved through the district in groups, stopping every person they found, checking papers, separating those they wanted from those they released. It was chaotic and terrifying for the people caught in it. For Pilecki, standing in line, keeping his breathing steady, keeping his face neutral, it was the most dangerous moment of his life so far. When the guard reached him, Pilecki handed over his false papers, Jan Tomasz Serafiński. The guard examined them, looked at Pilecki, looked back at the papers, and stamped them. Pilecki was loaded onto a truck with hundreds of other prisoners. He did not allow himself to feel relief. He was exactly where he had chosen to be. The mission had begun. He was processed at a transit facility, held for 2 days, and then transported east. On September 22, 1940, the truck stopped and the prisoners were ordered out. He was at Auschwitz. What greeted him was designed to destroy the human mind before the human body. The SS had developed a processing ritual that was not merely administrative, it was psychological annihilation. Prisoners were stripped of their clothing, their heads were shaved, their personal possessions, everything that connected them to a life, to a name, to a family, were taken. And then a number was tattooed onto their left forearm. Pilecki's number was 4859. He was told, in a language he understood, because the SS conducted these procedures in Polish, for maximum comprehension, that he was no longer a person. He was a unit, a tool. His value was measured in the work he could produce. When that work was done, he had no value at all. That was the first lesson of Auschwitz, and they taught it with absolute consistency, every day, to every prisoner, through starvation and violence and the casual murder of anyone who showed any sign of resistance or individuality. The Auschwitz that Pilecki entered in September 1940 was not yet the full industrial killing.
This is one of the most painful and contested chapters in the history of the Second World War, and historians have been arguing about it ever since. The arguments are complicated. Some officials genuinely found the scale of what Pilecki was describing impossible to accept, not because they were callous, but because nothing in human history had ever looked like this before, and the human mind struggles to believe what it has no frame of reference for. Some were skeptical of the sources. Some were focused on other theaters of the war. Some made strategic calculations that did not include the rescue of concentration camp prisoners as a military priority. One British intelligence officer, reviewing the Polish reports in 1942, wrote a marginal note on the document that has survived in the archives. 2 words: seems exaggerated. Seems exaggerated. While Pilecki was tattooed with number 4859, while he was watching thousands of human beings murdered every week, while he was smuggling out, at the risk of his life and the lives of everyone in his network, the exact numbers, the exact methods, the exact names of the officers conducting the operations, seems exaggerated. Pilecki also had a military plan, not just an intelligence mission. He had analyzed the camp and concluded that a coordinated uprising from inside, combined with an armed attack by the Polish Home Army from outside and a weapons airdrop from Allied aircraft, could liberate Auschwitz. The prisoners would rise, the guards would be overwhelmed, the camp would be destroyed. Tens of thousands of people would be freed. He sent the plan out through his network. He waited. The response came back through the same channels. The Polish Home Army was stretched beyond capacity across occupied Poland. The Allies were committed to North Africa, to the Pacific, to the planning for the invasion of France. An operation to liberate a single concentration camp in the interior of occupied Poland, one that would require substantial resources and carry significant risk, was not something they were prepared to undertake. There would be no rescue mission. Pilecki received this information in late 1942 and into 1943. He had been inside Auschwitz for more than 2 years. He had built an organization of nearly 1,000 men. He had smuggled out detailed intelligence that was, as far as he knew, reaching the highest levels of Allied command. And the response was silence. He made a decision. If the world would not come to Auschwitz, he had to go to the world. He had to get out. Not because he was giving up, but because he understood that a living witness with first-hand testimony who could sit in a room with Allied commanders and look them in the eye and tell them what he had seen was more powerful than any written report. He had to escape, and he had to tell his story in person. The problem was that escaping from Auschwitz was, in the most literal sense, nearly impossible. The camp was surrounded by multiple layers of electrified fencing. Guard towers with searchlights covered every section of the perimeter. Dogs patrolled the outer zones. Every prisoner was accounted for in multiple daily roll calls. When someone was missing, the entire prisoner population was kept standing in the roll call square, regardless of weather, until the person was found or confirmed dead. If a prisoner escaped, 10 other prisoners from their barracks were executed. This was not a rule that was sometimes enforced. It was a rule that was always enforced. In 3 years of the camp's operation, only a handful of prisoners had escaped successfully. Many more had tried and been caught. Those who were caught were hanged publicly in front of thousands of prisoners as a demonstration of what escape meant. The SS understood that the fear of death was a more effective barrier than any physical fence. They cultivated that fear deliberately and systematically. Pilecki planned his escape anyway. He had been assigned to work in the camp bakery, a stroke of good fortune that gave him access to a building near the perimeter and a work schedule that included night shifts. He spent months studying everything: the rotation patterns of the guards, the angles of the searchlights, the timing of the patrols.
The moment, the specific narrow window of seconds when one guard's field of vision ended and the next guard's had not yet begun. He identified 2 other prisoners who would come with him, men he trusted completely, men who understood what they were doing and what the odds were. He chose a date, April 26, 1943. The night of the escape, the 3 men were on the night shift at the bakery. At approximately 2 in the morning, they cut the telephone line near the building, a small act of sabotage that would create momentary confusion in the guard communication system. In the window that followed, they broke through a locked door, moved through the darkness to the perimeter, and went through the wire. By Pilecki's own account, written after the war, those few minutes between the fence and the tree line were the longest of his life. He expected at every step to hear the alarm, to hear the dogs, to see the searchlight find him. He ran in the dark, and he did not look back. They were not caught. For the next 5 days, the 3 men moved through the Polish countryside, hiding in barns and haystacks, guided at night by local farmers who fed them and risked their lives to keep them moving. The Germans launched a search operation. Pilecki had anticipated it and had built his escape route around places the searchers were unlikely to look and people who could be trusted absolutely. After 5 days on the run, Witold Pilecki reached the Polish resistance network and made contact. He had been inside Auschwitz for 2 years, 7 months, and 12 days. He was free. The first thing Pilecki did after reaching safety, before he rested, before he slept properly, before he did almost anything else, was write. He sat down and he produced what is now known as the Pilecki Report. It ran to more than 100 pages. It was the most detailed, systematic, first-hand account of Auschwitz that had ever existed. It named names, SS officers, their ranks, their specific roles in the killing operation. It described the physical layout of the camp with engineering precision. It provided death count estimates that have since been confirmed as remarkably accurate by post-war research. It described the gas chambers and the crematoria in language that was clinical and exact and devastating. He described individual people, a Polish priest he had watched beaten to death in front of other prisoners for refusing to renounce his faith, a young Soviet prisoner shot during a work detail because he stumbled and fell, a child. He was specific about the child, about what the child was wearing, about where the child was found, discovered alive underneath a pile of bodies that had been left in the snow. The child died before anyone could do anything. He delivered the report in person to the Polish Home Army Command in Warsaw. He briefed officers personally, sitting across a table from men who had been receiving his written reports for 2 years and who now, for the first time, were looking at the person who had written them. He was direct and systematic and emotionally controlled in the way of someone who has processed horror so thoroughly that expressing it with anything other than precision feels like a betrayal of the people he saw die. He asked for action. He asked for the bombing of the rail lines. He asked for a military operation. He asked the Home Army to relay his demands to the Allied command in London with the full weight of his first-hand authority behind them. The reports went up the chain, again. The Allied response was, again, insufficient. The request to bomb the rail lines leading to Auschwitz, which Pilecki and others had been making since 1942, and which he now renewed with the force of direct testimony, was debated with Allied command for another full year. The arguments against were strategic. The rail lines were far from established Allied air bases, the bombing accuracy of the era made hitting a specific target difficult, the resources could be better used elsewhere. These arguments were not entirely without merit militarily, but they were also, in the judgment of many historians, a rationalization for a choice that had already been made on other grounds, that the rescue of Jewish and other prisoners from Nazi extermination was not a military priority that could compete with other uses of Allied resources. The rail lines to Auschwitz were not bombed until the fall of 1944. In the year between Pilecki's report and that decision, the deportation and murder of Hungarian Jews accelerated to an almost incomprehensible pace. In the spring and summer of 1944, Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz at a rate of more than 10,000 people per day. Approximately 400,000 of them were murdered. Pilecki knew this was happening. He continued working. He was assigned by the Home Army to various intelligence and organizational tasks in Warsaw. He continued gathering information. He continued training resistance members. He continued doing what he had always done, finding the thing that needed to be done and doing it without waiting for someone else to decide it was worth doing. And then August 1944 arrived. The Warsaw Uprising. For 63 days, the Polish Home Army, armed with a fraction of the weapons they needed, without the air support or military assistance from the Allies that they had been promised and expected, fought block by block, building by building, room by room, against the full weight of the German military machine. The Soviets, whose armies were positioned just across the Vistula River, halted their advance and waited. Churchill and Roosevelt argued over how to help and reached no agreement in time to matter. The Poles fought alone. Pilecki fought in the uprising. He was assigned to a company fighting in the Mokotów district of Warsaw. He carried a rifle and he fought as a soldier, which was in some ways the simplest and most straightforward thing he had done since the war began. No deception, no cover identity, no careful management of information. Just a man with a weapon fighting for the city he loved. The uprising collapsed on October 2nd, 1944. The Polish forces survived under negotiated terms. Pilecki went into German captivity as a prisoner of war, protected this time, at least on paper, by the Geneva Convention. He spent the remainder of the war in German POW camps, first at Lambanovich and then at Murnau in Bavaria. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Pilecki was alive. He had survived Auschwitz, he had survived the Warsaw Uprising, he had survived 3 years of intelligence work in one of the most dangerous environments in the world. He was 44 years old. He had been fighting, in one form or another, for 6 years. Any reasonable man in that moment would have gone home. Pilecki went to Italy first, where the Polish Second Corps, a large Polish military force that had fought with the Allies in the Italian campaign, was stationed. He reported to General Anders and gave a full debriefing. He wrote another version of his Auschwitz report for the military record. He talked to officers, to intelligence analysts, to anyone who would listen. And then in 1945, he made the decision that would kill him. He went back to Poland. Poland in 1945 was not a liberated country, not in the way that France was liberated, or Belgium, or the Netherlands. Poland had been conquered by Germany, and then unconquered by the Soviet Union, and the difference between those two states of affairs was less than the Western Allies were willing to admit. The Soviet-backed Polish provisional government was already consolidating power. The apparatus of Stalinist control was being put in place with extraordinary speed. The secret police, the purge of political opponents, the systematic arrest and execution of anyone whose loyalty was to Polish independence rather than to Moscow. The Polish Home Army, the organization that had fought the Germans for 5 years, was being treated not as a heroic resistance, but as an enemy of the new state. Its officers were being arrested. Some were tortured and executed. Some disappeared into the Soviet prison system. Some fled to the West. The crime in every case was the same: having fought for the wrong Poland. A Poland that was independent. A Poland that answered to its own people rather than to Stalin. Pilecki understood all of this. He was not naive about what was happening in his country. He had seen what Soviet power looked like from the inside during the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, and he had no illusions about what it meant for Poland's future. But he also believed that someone had to stay. Someone had to document what the new occupiers were doing, their military positions, their security apparatus, their methods of control, the names of the people they were arresting and killing. Someone had to get that information to the West, to the Polish government in exile in London, to anyone who might eventually be able to act on it.